diversity, accessibility, cohesion, inclusivity. These are perhaps four of the most popular buzzwords in cultural policies and strategies whenever we want to explore ways to develop perhaps future actions for our towns and cities and regions. It is also common to think of these as some kind of ticking box exercise every time we apply for funding for a grant, because we're all the time being asked, how do we engage with these communities? But I think the most important thing is that we reflect a little bit on why. Why is there such a need to even bring forward the idea of inclusivity in our own communities? Now, when we think of the way we work and live as people living, for example, in the European Union, we now choose to live and work wherever we want to. This freedom, however, doesn't necessarily come with guaranteed openness and perhaps a welcoming hug in every town or city. Also, this idea that culture itself is somewhat fixed, this idea that it remains unchanged for centuries. It's something that defines us, and this is the way we are. And if you don't like this, literally, go back to your own country. These are constant struggles that so many different communities live with on a daily basis, even in my own country, for example. And it's actually scary that it still permeates across various groups. Just think about the rise of nationalism, for example, in contemporary political culture, and say the arguments in favor of Brexit that has emerged in recent years. Now, of course, perhaps I'm preaching to the converted here, and I encourage us all to think that identity itself is not fixed. Neither is culture, and each culture is a complex ecosystem of multiple identities shaped by the identity of each and every one of us. Now, this doesn't mean that there isn't a dominant specificity that defines a cultural characteristic of a town or region. That's what makes us different, and that is what we need to celebrate and engage with, be it our language, our culinary traditions, our music, etc. This is ultimately that defines us when you say this is who we are. But even when we think of who we are, at times we think of us as this dominant group, as one. Even that is kind of split into so many different identities, be it sexual orientation, gender identity, the economic status, citizenship status, age, or religion itself. Now, when we're working on culture and thinking of culture in our own institutions, my provocation to you is inspired by the number of questions and challenges I see even in my own work, working with different arts organizations across the world. And I think the first important question we need to ask is, what is my privilege and what is my power? How do I actually recognize this, and how do I mobilize this privilege and power for the common good? We need to understand, first and foremost, the most important thing. The culture and access to culture and participation in culture is a fundamental human right. So from our own position of privilege and power, how do we actually use this to engage with different communities? The second point I'd like to raise is challenge your own worldview and the worldview of your own organization and institution. It took us years, even centuries, to decolonize, for example, our art collections, to even acknowledge that the narratives we have may not necessarily be the right narratives to move forward in the future. So acknowledging that is where we need to start. Once you acknowledge that power, once you look at also the narratives you've created, and you haven't questioned, for example, now's the time to start taking that a step forward. The third point I'd like to propose is choosing your words wisely, because choice of words matter. Here are a couple of examples. And I've referred to this earlier, for example, thinking of culture as one, thinking of identity as one. So if you start shifting, for example, identities, working with people from various identities, for example, rather than looking at your audience, your visitors, your collaborators as this one cohort. Another terminology, thinking of outreach versus engagement. I wish we banned the word outreach. Why? Because it assumes that we are at the center of attention, of importance, that we're so important that somebody out there on the periphery, some particular group, is in need of our work. Maybe not, probably not. But what if we start thinking of engagement, of actually having mutuality, where we are mutually engaging together and working together? We're not doing something extraordinary by saying, look, there's a particular group, underrepresented group, we're reaching out to, as if they actually need our help. This is a kind of narrative that has been taking us even for years and years to even various cultural policies, thinking that this notion, which we agree with, that this is public good, whereby these communities, in one way or another, there is a distance between us and we are reaching out. No, we're not the center. We're not, we are not perhaps even that important. And maybe this is where we need to start rethinking ourselves. What is our position within the community? Why? Because we play a very small part of the wider ecology of how communities thrive, develop, and change. And if we really want culture to be part of this conversation, we're not reaching out. We need to engage. Another point of reflection in terms of choice of words is looking at community in its plural, communities. Why? Because here you are acknowledging, you're emplacing and actively recognizing that you want to work with multiple groups, age, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, and people from various religions. The other choice, which I encourage you to reflect on, is equity versus equality. Equity involves us trying to understand and giving people what they need to enjoy and participate in culture. Equality, in contrast, aims to ensure that everyone gets the same treatment, that everyone gets the same things to participate in culture. So you may say, I'm inviting a minority group to come and watch my show for free at a reduced price. This provides equality in a way, fine, because I'm providing access to everyone to participate in a group that, for example, before was not engaging with my organization. But probably the show you're inviting them to watch was programmed, written, performed by people who are not part of that minority group, who have not engaged with that minority group, and who are not telling the story of that minority group. And in the arts, in the cultural and creative sectors, be it through visual arts, performing arts, whatever, films, we tell stories. Now, if we want to tell stories that really provide inclusivity, those stories need to be told by that particular community. Which means that you need to engage and empower that community to create its own narrative and therefore contribute to co-create an inclusive community. This also means that you need to provide equity by, for example, leveraging resources and sufficient resources to provide just and fair inclusion. This will require you to rethink your own power and status within the institution. For example, how many people from different communities represent that community on your board? How many of these people are co-creating or creating a programming work? How much access are you providing and resources for underprivileged communities to be able to improve and increase their accessibility to lead, for example? I have come across another example, various art centers, for example, that provide wheelchair access to public areas, yet have very limited wheelchair access to dressing rooms, for example, or the stage itself, implying that, of course, they acknowledge that everyone could have equal access to as an audience member, Yet, very few have thought of a wheelchair user as an artist to create in that space. The fourth and final point I would like to encourage you to reflect on is identifying who you want to create with and make a difference. Surely, if you had to look at your own policies and your own websites, you do not deliberately say that we engage only with one community or we deliberately leave out a particular community. But a little point of reflection should ask you to direct you to think and reflect on who are you not engaging with right now and why. And that probably is going to open up a very interesting conversation with what you want to do with your own organization and how you want to engage that particular community in co-creating. There are no quick wins on how to build inclusive towns and cities, and probably your first step needs to be by shaking the foundations and rebuilding together.